and welcome to another session of Talking TRM. I'm bexdeadman, and I'm an independent consultant specialising in ISO 31030. During my journey, I've had the opportunity to meet several different people in lots of different areas that travel risk as an umbrella covers. And during these podcasts, I'm asking them the same three questions because what they all have in common is an underlying passion and generally a story. There's a reason why they're in this space and they're making the changes that they're making. So, as people begin their journey, we're hoping that these conversations are going to help. So today I am very excited because I'm joined by a really good friend of mine, and I am saying friend, I'm not even hesitating on that.
Yep.
Sara McKenna from the Continuity Forum. And we met we were just talking about it offline, but I think
Yep.
2020, when Russell basically found me and asked me to start sort of doing some work, and then introduce me to yourself and to obviously the lovely Vanessa, who we've done a podcast with too.
We have.
So yes, when we'll talk about a little bit more about that, but that's kind of where our background is.
Yeah.
So without further ado, Sara, let's let everyone know who you are and what you do, and then obviously that will talk about how we connected as well.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm Sara McKenna, and I'm the program director here at the Continuity Forum. And I always like to say that my role is fairly self-explanatory. I direct the various programs that the forum undertakes, and that can range from small and simple research programs on specific risk-related areas, and can go right up to major events and seminars, advising governments and that sort of thing. And it's quite exciting work, actually, and it also means that I work on an international basis. The only downside to that is that my working hours are a bit fluid, but it does mean that I get to work in some really, really interesting areas. And I've worked in the area of standards specifically for a good few decades now. And my first experience was taking a company through ISO 9001, the quality standard. Now, I wasn't running the program, but I got involved with it and got to know the manager who was taking us through the program really well. And I just thought this was the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen. The fact that we could take individual processes within an organization and write down the processes to use, because I was a great one for, little shortcuts here. But actually realizing that if you want to make sure that everybody is able to work at the same level as the sort of best in the organization, having a standard to apply to the organization is a really, really good way to go. Now, that was the quality procedure even before it became an ISO, back when it was BS 5750. So that kind of dates me a little, but it is a long time ago. But that was when my fascination with and even love of standards started. And I then sort of moved on from the corporate world and started working with the forum. And I'm proud to say that we were actually instrumental in bringing about the standard for business continuity. And that was as a direct result of some other work that we've been doing, which was a research program into what was then mostly termed disaster recovery, which was kind of the the umbrella that covered everything. So we started looking at it and thought, well, some of the services being offered to organizations are great. Some are not quite so great, and there was no way that people could tell the difference between the really quality organisations and the ones who were a little less scrupulous in their practices. So there was no official standard to offer as proof of capability. The diligent organisations out there were literally struggling to prove that their service was genuine and an honest proposition, whereas their less scrupulous competitors were frequently winning contracts based on price, with little to no experience. And it was a worry. So we kind of mooted the idea of a BC standard, a business continuity standard. And this was in the early 2000s, when the term business continuity was effectively brand new. And I tell you, we faced some stiff opposition. It was felt that the subject matter was too complex, too difficult to quantify. But our view on that was, well, if it's hard to quantify, then that's all the more reason to have a standard to work to, so that you can differentiate the good practice services from the, again, I'm saying less scrupulous a lot, please forgive, but, they were out there. So yes, ultimately, we managed to persuade people that it was a really good idea to start doing this. And I'm pleased to say it was hugely successful, quickly adopted, and equally quickly went from a British standard for business continuity into an international one. And that led directly to the formation of ISO 3000, the risk management standard, all are interconnected. There was some argument, does business continuity take the lead? Does risk management take the lead? But ultimately, we don't care who takes the lead as long as the lead is taken and it's done well. But as I say, very successful, massive adoption. And I'm pleased to say that it's now one of the top 5 international standards in use today. And when you consider that the other in the top 5 are health and safety, which is no surprise to anybody, energy management, because obviously that refers to critical infrastructure, information security management, I think enough said, it's vital, and the quality standard that I talked about earlier. So it's a clear demonstration that risk management and all the various subsets, it's a globally important topic. And yeah, we were really, really proud of the work that we did to bring that to fruition. So that's me, what I do.
Sara, what an amazing story. So it's so nice to actually hear you say that, and for our listeners to be able to hear this, because it's something that I talk about in such a brief format all the time. So when I'm
Mhm.
introducing this idea of travel risk management and
Yeah,
kind of where we're positioned and where we think it's going to go over the next few years, I kind
yeah,
of lean back to this idea of, it's come from disaster recovery, which moved into business continuity, which finally has kind of moved into this risk management
yeah,
space. But actually hearing that from the people that were there when they were doing it is great. So I
yeah.
think that's really important to share.
It's quite funny. I can remember a meeting that we were at when we finally got the British standard, as it was back then, for business continuity together. Out of nowhere, 2 people, myself and one of the sort of elders of business continuity, if you like, basically gave exactly the same quote from Shakespeare at the same time. "These scars I had me on Crispin's day," and it was like, yeah, it has been a battle, but we made it.
I bet it has, because there's this world, isn't there, where kind of I've never understood it ever since I've been in corporate, but it's kind of like business just does what business does.
Yeah,
And some of that might be, as you call it, scrupulous. Some of it, I think, is definitely like unintentional as well. There's
I
just a
agree. Yes.
complete lack of knowledge. And that's part of risk, isn't it?
Mm,
Know the risks, and then you decide how you want to play them. If you want to be higher risk on that, that's your call. No one's telling you what not to do.
no.
Um, but there's also businesses out there, often smaller businesses, who are fighting so hard because they are doing things perhaps in a different area, or they're doing things in a different way, which is
Yeah,
actually really beneficial, but they just can't get a look in. And I
yeah.
think as we move into this world of, the larger corporations now have to abide to certain standards. And if they don't have to, then they're wanting to, because actually their own employees are looking at them to do that now.
They are, yes.
There's a lot of, people want to know that they're working for the right sort of company. This is where, some of your work with sustainability and all of that's kind of coming out. This stuff it's happening and it's there, and companies kind of need to answer to that now.
Yeah,
It has a knock-on effect to those smaller companies too. But I think what's so great about these risk standards is it was designed for everybody from the
yes, it was.
beginning.
Yeah. And it's really easy to read as well, because I think one of the best things, if you like, about 31,000 is that it's not just a standard that you can read. There's also a handbook. And in some ways, I think particularly the smaller organizations, because, going through the standards process, it's time consuming. It can be quite costly. But if you take a look at the handbook that's available, invest in that first, it just gives you such good guidance on how to proceed and how to differentiate yourself. And the other thing to remember is that for the smaller organizations, sometimes even getting onto a tender list can really, really, well, some organizations, you can't even get onto the tender list unless you apply the standard to your organization. So it's a sales tool as well. So it's more than just organizing your business. It's about promoting your business, being able to enter into those contracts that you perhaps couldn't get onto before. So yeah, it is very, very useful.
No, I completely agree. And I think, Sarah, one of my misconceptions of standards when I first got into this, when I was running a business or, working for someone else's business, it just was always seen as like an awful thing you had to kind of get
Yeah.
through and do.
Yeah.
And it was
More red
a
tape.
task, and it
Yeah.
was arduous. And how dare people ask all these questions?
Yes.
Actually, we've just lived through a pandemic, and those companies that had kind of maybe done a bit of pre-planning on this have
Yeah.
probably fared better than
Yeah.
those that didn't. And it's not to say that was the case for everyone, but it's just about being proactive in this space, and thinking about what's best for the future, isn't
Yeah.
it? And making sure that you're
Absolutely.
resilient for it.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be seen as a task to endure. It should be
No.
seen as an understanding of your business, I think, and that's what we try and get
Yeah,
to.
I mean, I'm enough of a geek that I think it's interesting, and a fascinating process to go through. But I have been really pleasantly surprised by so many people who do have that mindset. Oh yeah, more red tape, more tick boxes I've got to go through, who've actually found out areas of their business that are really, really good that they've never really spotted before. And it's an ability to then promote that because they found it through their risk management processes. And that happens more often than you might imagine. So yeah, it can be really, really hugely beneficial.
No, I completely agree, and I have these conversations frequently now with businesses that I'm working with. So in
Yeah,
the space that, which leads us nicely on to obviously the space that we're talking about. So we met because of the travel risk management standard, because of
we did.
31030, and in the final throes of that, just obviously before it got finally launched
Yeah.
and changed my life because I threw in
Yes.
my job and decided to set up a consultancy and now just talk about this stuff all of the time.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a jump for you from the sort of risk management piece and actually understanding the travel piece, because that's obviously one of the reasons that Russell plucked me and found me and got me involved. So what how do you feel about all of this now? What is your why for driving this stuff forward in travel risk? What's happened for you during this process?
Well, it's more than just the process actually, because I have both personal and professional reasons to be really passionate about travel risks specifically. On a personal level, I've experienced personally, again, at first hand, effectively, just how awful a lack of travel risk management can be. Back in the 1980s, I was on what we used to call a business jolly. The whole organisation was taken to this beautiful European destination for a 5-day trip. We were supposed to bond, to ski, and let off scheme, and it was, it was absolutely wonderful. Just organised very much on the cheap, I will say, because it was a case of how much will it cost to get the entire company out there? What's the cheapest hotel that we can tolerate? That was basically the basis on the understanding that we were there to enjoy ourselves. So that was how it was done. But on the third day of the trip, one of our very large party decided to go off alone and walk back to our hotel, and she was brutally attacked. And we had absolutely no one to turn to for assistance. The hotel did try to act as interpreters, for example, with the police, but ultimately we were pretty much on our own in terms of helping our colleague. And I will add, we were a really, really young company, and I was maybe 24, something like that. And yet I was one of the elders. So a lot of what happened, what transpired, fell to a very young group of managers with no training, no understanding, and all we really had to offer our friend, our colleague, was empathy. And we faced a huge language barrier as well. There was an extremely unhelpful police officer and a hotel management team that was effectively more concerned about shielding what had happened from the rest of their guests. They were more interested in doing that than actually helping us. So, yeah, all the way back then, it made me realize, actually, this is a big problem. And as you can probably tell, this experience has stayed with me for a long, long time. So risk
Cool.
management itself is a passion for me, but travel risk management specifically speaks to me, not just because of that experience, but also because when we, at the Continuity Forum, first started looking at a more industry specific version of risk management, it was really quickly very clear that this was an industry that genuinely wanted to improve. Absolute music to our ears. And I've been so impressed with how those within the industry have engaged with us, have shared their organisation's approaches with us, and perhaps more important than anything else, they've actively wanted to learn how to improve. They want to ensure that their industry bounces back from the impacts of COVID, and that they don't simply go back to business as was. There seems to be a genuine desire to be better. So yeah, I could not be happier. But I've also learned, obviously, with my risk management head on, sort of learning all about the travel processes, that the business traveller and the travel risk, it's a really complex beast. And there are so many interconnected issues, hurdles, and actually benefits. But the committee involved with the work that we have in process have a very, very simple goal. We want to ensure that the business traveller can go from their front door to the front desk of their hotel and to everywhere in between those destinations, even if it's not strictly speaking for the business reason that they're there, and all the way right back to their front door, being secure, being safe, and having the knowledge that if anything goes wrong, they know who to call, what to do. And I think most importantly, and what was missing for me at the time, was how to go about it, how to rectify matters, how to overcome whatever problem you've hit. So if the business traveller is complex, now imagine how complicated the process is of forming a new standard. It's a deep dive into the industry. So it is time consuming, but it's also really rewarding. And the reason it's so complex is that we need to consider all the areas of the travel plan, and there are so many issues. It can be a taxi to the airport, it can be does somebody need a wheelchair go through the airport. There's so many things that we need to cover. So yes, it's been interesting, but I think we're getting there. So yeah, I'm really pleased with it. But I think one of the most important things for me, in working through this, has been learning about communicating with the people involved, right from the traveller themselves all the way through their specific management team, through HR, risk officers, communication teams, those responsible for the reputation of their organisations. They all need to communicate well. So that means we need to look at all the various aspects of travel from a risk perspective, not just from a how cheap can we get this perspective, so that we can highlight any potential issues, offer guidance, help people to understand how to select a suitable management company or a consultant, and really ensure that both the traveller and the organisation is in a really strong position of knowledge to proceed with the journey. So we need to encourage everybody involved to think about more than just the cost of the flights, which, as I explained earlier, was pretty much what my organisation did, and really look more deeply. And I think I'm going to refer back to one of the previous interviewees, Jim Lawrence. I
Mm.
think he put it really, really beautifully when he said, we need to make risk a purchasing metric. Excuse
I
me.
couldn't agree more. I mean, I so enjoyed the podcast with Jim, as you can imagine, because
Yeah,
he's a lot of fun.
he
But
is.
it's this idea of making this of something that actually people should know about and make it into a category. We've done this on a tender just recently with a client I'm working with. We think we've possibly done the first travel risk management solutions microservices, long
Nice.
title, RFP, to do exactly this, because it's not just about high risk destinations, is it?
No,
It's
it's
not
not.
just about it's about covering for everybody in every eventuality, and I know that you're pretty passionate about that side of it as well, so maybe you can explain a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's another one of those issues that is critical to me that I'm really passionate about is protecting specific travellers, and I don't like to call them vulnerable travellers because it sounds a bit patronising, but there are specific travellers who have risks that others don't face, and that's whether they're women travelling alone or those from the LGBTQ community travelling to less tolerant countries. We need to consider the traveller's health, whether that's physical or mental, but what that does do is it means we have to ask some difficult questions. But using the standard actually gives us the reasoning behind what could otherwise be seen as really intrusive questioning. Asking about a person's health, sexuality, and so on is actually both requesting and using confidential and highly personal information. So it has to be done with the utmost care. And the standard lets us demonstrate that we are acting with their best interests at heart, and why, offering the why behind these questions. And it lets us ensure that their business and personal self is protected, while at the same time assuring them of confidentiality. That to me is one of the most important areas.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm smiling because I completely agree with you. I think, Sarah, thank you so much. I think that the journey that I've been on with you, and I think just to pick up on some of the things you talked about, how I think let's recognise how welcoming the travel industry has been. I think that's so important, and it
Very much so.
continues to be.
Yes.
And this kind of awareness, this understanding that they want to learn, which is wonderful. I sometimes get frustrated because I feel, from my perspective, that actually it can be moving a lot faster, and it's really important, but you see
Yeah.
it from the other side, which is how other many industries you've worked with, and it's not been as easy as this at all.
Yeah. It's not easy. I wouldn't go that far, but it is easier. And I think the enthusiasm that we've seen from so many different types of organisations, so many different sizes of organisations, I think it's very telling that this is an industry that wants to learn, that wants to do better. It's golden. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, and I should just appreciate that perhaps rather than be on at everyone all the time. But that's my role, so it's okay. So okay,
Mhm.
that leads us really nicely on. I think so. You talked in such a well-rounded area about all of this, and thank you, because for me there is just so many different avenues and so many different parts that this covers. So let's just talk about now, for those people that are just beginning to kind of get into this, they're just beginning to think, oh, actually, should I? What
Mm.
what what off what advice, what golden nuggets? I'm pluralizing because I think you may have more
I
than one.
do.
You can offer.
Yeah, well, I've had a bit of a think, to quote one of my favourite authors, and I think probably one of the best starting places for people to understand why we're working on a travel risk standard, why we're looking at expanding it, is to take a look at the definitions. And there are two definitions to me that are really important that people know. And the first is the ISO definition of risk, which, as per ISO 31000, is risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. The uncertainty being the risks and the objectives being the ultimate goal of your organization, whatever that goal might be. And the second is the definition of risk management, which is the coordinated, and this is verbatim, the coordinated activities to direct and control an organization with regard to risk. And I think if you take a look at those definitions, it really helps you to understand where we're coming from, why we're looking at things, and how we can help. And to me, risk management means that organizations ideally should identify and then fully examine any potential risks they face. And by doing that, they can reduce the uncertainty and therefore reduce any likely impact, and possibly, well, actually, I'd go so far as to say probably enhance the benefits that they'll find. We do have to accept that we're never going to avoid all risks. There is no perfection in this world. But if we ensure that we are aware of the risks, and by making sure that we know about them, that we've examined them, we've understood them, and we've mitigated against them, then we can certainly be better than we are right now. And it also gives us an opportunity to foresee the likely consequences that we can face. And Russell likes to use an analogy, which I'm going to blatantly steal. When you're driving a car, you've got the the view through the windscreen, which shows us where we want to go, and then you've got the view through the rear view mirror, which shows us where we've been. Now, if we use our mirror view to assess and hopefully avoid hazards that we've already experienced or seen or heard, basically driven past, we can then use that to inform our practices for the way forward and achieve our goals more effectively. And I also think that we need to take a good look at balancing the need for travel risk. I think this is something that was highlighted during COVID, that maybe many business travels were not entirely necessary, that they were, to go back to my earlier point, one of those jollies. We shouldn't get rid of them entirely, but we do need to think about the justifications. Are the reasons for travel legitimate? Will the journey result in actual benefits? And that can be new business, new contacts, customer satisfaction, that sort of thing. And do they have potential downsides, which is the uncertainty part of the definition? Has that been covered? And it's really important to remember that risk can be both good and bad. We need to keep an open mind on that. Another nugget I have is communication, and I've mentioned it earlier. A good standard is only as good as its users. We need to have a top-down leadership, but also bottom-up engagement. The traveller themselves needs to understand that they have responsibilities and they need to own them. And obviously the management need to recognise their responsibilities, take them seriously and act accordingly. One other thing is that you should always seek feedback from the traveller when they're back. We need to take a look at what went well. Did they face any major problems or even minor hiccups that were more of an annoyance than anything? Even if it was just a minor annoyance, can we avoid that in the future? And we can learn from those. And most importantly, we can improve our processes and policies for future business travel. And I think my last nugget is a phrase that I've heard quite a lot, and I can't remember who said it. It might even have been me, but it's basically deal with it while it's a risk, not when it's a crisis.
Beautiful. I mean, I've hardly said anything in this podcast, and I've loved every second.
Sorry.
I know, Sarah, this is what I wanted. So it's the knowledge that this lady has and the journey that she's been on is just so worth sharing. And it's exactly the essence of why I wanted to put this podcast together, Sarah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It's all about proactive. I think we have to understand that we live in a world where things are overly complicated, people are overly complicated, and things are going to happen.
Yeah,
And I've worked for numerous companies that, have said things like, well, you can just never plan for everything. What's the point of planning for anything? And I,
yeah.
I, I get it.
I hear that a lot.
But it's not gonna help us move forward and pass. And actually, when something happens and it affects human life
Yeah.
or an asset, but generally
Mhm.
a human life being the most important, no, there's a moral obligation here to do better,
There
and
is.
and that's what and a legal obligation, quite frankly, but
Yes.
a moral obligation, and that's obviously why we work in the space that we work in, and I think everyone can probably understand why when I met Sarah, I was like, oh, okay. how am I going to make this work? How am I going to basically be with her constantly? Which we've managed to do
We have.
virtually quite a lot. So it's nice. Um, Thank you, Sarah. I honestly wouldn't be here without you and the other people I've met along my journey. So it's been incredible. And I'm so excited because I know that we're at the beginning of a journey for maybe the next decade
Yeah.
and we've got so much more to cover.
Oh, we're gonna be together for a while.
We are, aren't we?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Just to everybody, you have been listening to Bex Deadman and the wonderful Sara McKenna from the Continuity Forum. You've been listening to Talking TRM, and we will be back soon with another episode. Stay in touch. If you want to subscribe, the details are below. And if you want to contact any of us, our details are at the end of this podcast on screen. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you to our listeners, and we will be back soon. Take care.